Hi, it's Stu Stover again. We're picking up where we left off last time. Last time we did the mercantilism theory and some of the problems with mercantilism. And so Adam Smith was absolutely convinced mercantilism was a bad system. And I'll give you some of the reasons for that. Obviously in 10 minutes I can't give them all, but I can hopefully give you the high points here. And if you're interested, you can dive in because there's just a ton of information on Adam Smith. But we call Adam Smith's theory free market economics. We could also call it classical economics, so we hear that term a lot these days, going back to classical. The last time we really, as a society, sort of embraced all this stuff was the 1920s. And it was the heyday in some ways of the sort of classical economic theory. So let me just give you some of the high points here. So Adam Smith, all right, before I give you the high points, this was his second book. His first book was The Theory of Moral Sentiment, where he built the case that we have obligations for each other. And so that notion of empathy and compassion that, sometimes is viewed in today's world as a sort of a liberal progressive notion. He thought that was fundamental to understanding economics, that we have that framework as a place to start. Now, for the most part, theory of moral sentiment is kind of a footnote in history, not nearly as important as his book that he wrote in 1776 that is called The Wealth of Nations. And so the question is a good one of what is wealth? And how do we determine that? How do we do economic growth to get more wealth in a society? So Mercantile had some notions of that, and their basic notion was what we would call a zero-sum game. The zero-sum game, it's kind of an economic term, but it implies that if somebody is going to win, somebody has to lose at the same rate. So it's, the total is a fixed quantity. So if somebody gets wealthier, it means somebody else has to get poorer. If somebody actually moves up, it means, so this notion that you're taking from somebody else was very much a part of that mercantile strategy. Adam Smith said, no, we can create win-wins here. And David Ricardo, who's the next guy I'm going to be talking about, he was even more emphatic that you can create win-wins and it doesn't have to be predatory. And we'll talk about what that means in the next episode of this. But free markets made the assumption is that the marketplace decides what's valuable. The king doesn't decide. The king doesn't set prices. The king doesn't decide what's going to be produced in what quantities, but the marketplace will decide. Okay, we do that all the time. So if you're a farmer and the price of soybeans falls off the table because China is no longer buying American soybeans, so there isn't a market for them, what happens to the price of soybeans? It plummets. What is a responsible farmer going to do? Not plant soybeans. They'll plant corn or they'll plant something else because they're responding to what the marketplace dictates. And so Adam Smith was absolutely convinced you could take out of the hands of the king all this economic stuff and put it into the marketplace and it would be just fine. Now what that does, when you go down that path, you're building in mobility. Well, why are we building in mobility? Because new stuff is showing up, new technology, new methods, new all sorts of stuff. So the classic example is, of course, agriculture. So back in the 1700s, when Adam Smith was looking at this stuff, the agricultural community was still by far the dominant sector of the economy. It might have been 90, 95, 97, 98% in various societies in terms of the number of people that worked in agriculture. Well, once you start adopting this stuff and innovation starts to show up and you get better plows, you get get better fertilizers, you get better plants, you get better, all the stuff that starts to show up being better. All of a sudden, a farmer, instead of farming 5 to 10 acres, can now farm 50 to 100 acres. Well, what happens to all the people who used to be farmers, that now this one farmer has, in essence, taken their land in some sense? So private property is a critical issue under Adam Smith. You got to have private property. Well, what does that do? It creates the opportunity for those people who are no longer needed in agriculture to suddenly go to the cities, because what's starting to emerge in the late 1700s, early 1800s, in the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution? Okay, you're getting all the machines and the factories and the other things. And if you're going to have factories, don't you have to have labor that is available to work in these factories? Where are they going to come from? Well, they got to come from the surplus that we no longer need them out there in agriculture, and they can now work in this new environment. And that trend has not gone away. That trend is still with us in absolute positive, negative ways in American society today. So the marketplace decides mobility is important because people now have the option of leaving what they have always done. So that static society of mercantilism is starting to fragment. And all of a sudden you're getting a lot more flexibility in society in terms of where people work and what they do, what their skill set is, in all sorts of ways. So one of the things we typically talk about with Adam Smith is that he was, in many ways, the father of what we think of as focusing on the individual. So in mercantilism, you're focusing on the needs of the whole. The king, whatever the king needs, whether war is happening, whether, all the other stuff that is happening was critical under mercantilism, that it wasn't about the individual. Well, all of a sudden it is about the individual. So you've got all this new technology. Self-interest becomes a new term that is a powerful term. So mobility doesn't just mean you can move from the farm to the city, but mobility means that you can start your own business. You can do all sorts of things that might create wealth for yourself and your family, and all sorts of issues show up with mobility. So we use the word mobility in Econ today, not only to describe people moving. So, we live in Michigan. Michigan historically has had a negative growth rate. What does that mean? It means that people leave the state for jobs. And we've had several eras where we had lots of people leaving Michigan and going to wherever in the country. So mobility does mean we're talking about people who are moving from one location to another, but it's also mobility in terms of moving from one job to another, or moving economically from poor to lower middle, or whatever the mobility happens as we think about the process of people becoming more prosperous. So private property, and if any of you have traveled around the world, you know that private property is not nearly entrenched in many countries as it is in America. And so to have that assurance that you own this, and if you own property, what can you do with it? You can borrow against it. You can do all sorts of things. You could rent it out. It doesn't matter. But the idea is having clear title to that land opens up a world of possibilities. Okay, so the last one I'm going to say here, I'm going to get to an example here in a minute, but the last thing I'm going to say on his sort of basic approach is that free trade matters. So he was arguing, and relatively simple terms when he did it in Wealth of Nations, but that free trade doesn't have to be predatory, and you can create win-wins. And so when we get to David Ricardo, we'll get into more of the details of that stuff. So let me switch to the other one here. Are we okay? All right. So one of the examples, I know this sounds really strange, but one of Adam Smith's examples was the pin factory. All right, so in 1700s, we didn't have Velcro, we didn't have zippers, we had buttons were actually very expensive, and only the elites tended to have buttons. So how did people keep their clothes together? Pins were a standard way to do it. And so they were critical, pins were critical in all sorts of ways across the economy. So somebody's got to make them. Somebody's got to make them in a way that they can make money. All that stuff was part of the deal. But pins were also a part of the monetary system. So most of you know that the Canadians got rid of their penny, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, whenever they got rid of it, because it wasn't useful anymore. President Trump has pledged we're going to get rid of the penny. Thank you very much. We don't need the pennies anymore. They've outlived their usefulness as a piece of the monetary system, at least my opinion. Well, back in the day, you had a penny, but you actually broke it down into even smaller parts. So for example, 10 pins would equal 1 penny. So you could actually buy things for 1/10 of a penny in that old system of what was going on. So what's going on here? In the old system of mercantilism, you did have somebody making pins. I mean, it was necessary for society to have pins being made. So you had a guy who would wake up in the morning and he'd hook up the horses and the wagon, go into town and get a spool of wire. He'd come back, unhook the wagon, unhook the horse, take the spool of wire into a shop, and he'd stretch it out to the right diameter. He'd then switch to his cutting tool and he'd cut the pins at the right length. Then he would take those pins he had cut to the right length, he'd take them over and he'd sharpen one end of them. Well, what he knew next, I mean, you know, you can get the process here. What's going on is that he is doing all of the activities himself. Then he's got to bundle them up, and then he's got somebody shows up at the door and wants to buy them. He has to stop what he's doing and go sell some pins. How expensive are those pins? Those are expensive pins. Because what's actually happening here? He can't make very many because we have a term called transaction cost. And what does transaction cost mean? It means, are you actually spending the bulk of your day doing stuff, or are you moving from one activity to another? And the answer is, in the old system, that one guy is spending the bulk of his day doing everything but making pins. Setting up, taking down, horse, all this stuff. And so this adds a ton of cost to the process. So what did Adam Smith say? Adam Smith said, we need to specialize. Okay, specialization means, what do you got? You've got somebody who's responsible for transportation, okay, whatever, you know. So they're the ones who manage the horses and the wagons and get the supplies and bring them back and do all that stuff. You got somebody else who is stretching the wire, somebody else who's cutting the wire. And when you go to specialization, that one guy could make 100 pins a day. When you start to specialize, what tends to happen? Those 10 or those people that are there, they're going to make 1,000 pins a day. What happens to the price? Price goes down. How much? Probably a lot. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it depends. Depends on which side of the spectrum you're on. So this poor guy who's still doing it the old way, what's happened to his business? Unless he adapts, unless he changes, unless he innovates and does whatever, he's going to go out of business because he can no longer compete against this specialized, quote, modern pin factory. And so innovation becomes critical. So we're now incentivizing innovation. In the old mercantile system, what did we incentivize? Everybody staying in their lane, doing what their fathers and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers did, and very static societies. All of a sudden you have all sorts of change that's happening. So you can make the case, we got to preserve this guy's job. Excuse me? Do we want to preserve this guy's job? At what cost? Who's going to pay for that if we preserve that job? We talk about that, in political circles today, about should we preserve those old jobs? Well, sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is it's time to move on. Do we really want to subsidize blockbusters as an organization? I don't think so. So specialization has a ton of positive effects. So innovation, you're driving costs down, efficiency goes up, and you're delivering value to customers in a way that makes sense to customers. So it shifts the whole focus from doing stuff that we do and like to do to doing stuff that the customers will appreciate. So Adam Smith sort of turned the world of work on its head in some sense. Now, should this have turned into a wonderful scenario? Should it? Did it? No. Because what happened, at least in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, those unskilled workers who left the farm went and did unskilled work in the factories. They were still paid next to nothing. They were still very much viewed as sort of peasants in very negative ways, did not have great opportunities. So some of the advantages that were supposed to show up didn't show up until much later. Now, we're seeing a lot of the advantages of this today in all sorts of ways. There's problems with this, you bet there are. But the short answer is this created a brand new way to think about economics that turned the old order on its head. So where we're going next is we're going to look at David Ricardo. So David Ricardo showed up in 1820s, I think, when he wrote his stuff. So about 35 years after Adam Smith, and he really focused on the trade stuff. So we're going to look at tariffs and trade and all that kind of stuff in our next video. Thank you very much.